It's a game of semantics on this second part of Super NES Works episode 21. What does it mean for something to be a role-playing game? Honestly, wars have been fought over less contentious questions. Does it mean menu-based combat? Turn-based battles? Character statistics and experience levels earned through conflict? Character customization? Free-form player agency? A driving storyline? Do you have to have dungeons? Does it require dragons? Computer and console RPGs have been struggling for decades to capture the fundamental essence of the genre's urtext, Dungeons and Dragons. The thing is, no video game can recreate perfectly a D&D session because D&D, like other tabletop games, is driven by a human element. A D&D session can take many different forms. Even in the first edition of the game, you had adventure modules specifically centered around fighting through dungeons full of monsters, alongside setups for journeys that avoided conflict altogether. So sure, character classes and gathering loot and earning experience points factors into the primal soup of RPGs, but really, D&D was about the experience, the stories and conversations that emerged from a team of friends sitting around improvising solutions to a game master's scenario. Multiplayer RPGs like Ultima Online or World of Warcraft do a pretty good job of restoring that element, but there's no helping single-player RPGs, which is to say, the only RPGs that were possible for the first 20-odd years of the commercial video games industry's existence. So by the strictest, most legalistic standard, there's simply no such thing as a true single-player video game RPG. That would be an idiotic claim, of course. No, console and computer RPGs instead amount to a series of best faith efforts to enshrine as many aspects of the RPG concept as possible and make it their own. Inevitably, this involves making compromises, of excluding certain facets of the genre in order to fit within the limitations of the medium. A computer RPG can't be a true tabletop experience, but it can certainly reframe the individual components of tabletop gaming into a new, cohesive whole. The evolution of role-playing video games amounts to a constant push and pull between creative aspirations and technical realities. Designers constantly asking themselves, how do I create a faux role-playing experience that feels true to the genre's roots while still functioning as an entertaining work in its own right? I realize you don't watch Super NES Works for semantic breakdowns of genres. I'm only explaining this facet of RPGs in order to emphasize just what a breakthrough Squaresoft created with Final Fantasy II's narrative design, because ultimately role-playing games are about telling a story. With D&D, the story emerges from the conversations and decisions you make with your allies, and how you react to the random results of dice rolls. Once games like Akalabeth and Wizardry locked down the basics of simulating RPG combat with computers, the genre quickly shifted its focus to narrative. Stories became larger and more elaborate, with plot growing more and more central to the player's motivations. In less than a decade, we went from Wizardry, which amounted to get to the bottom of the dungeon and kill the wizard, to Phantasy Star 3, which told a tale that spanned both generations and solar systems. Still, none of these games had attempted to present anything as complex as Final Fantasy II's story. The remarkable thing about this adventure's plot is that it's at once enormous, yet intimate. It focuses on stakes that extend beyond the bounds of the world in which it's set, yet the characters' motivations and feelings are given just as much, if not more, emphasis as the larger plot machinations. Sure, Final Fantasy II's story relies too much on coincidence, empty melodrama, and a rapid-fire succession of events. But you have to see it in the context of 1991. Back then, it told its story more confidently and more elaborately within the framework of its in-game world and play mechanics than any RPG that had come before it. It set a new standard for the genre, and arguably for the medium as a whole. Within the limits of an 8-megabit cartridge, it managed to be as grand and epic as it possibly could be, and the rest of the world sat up and took notice. Of course, Final Fantasy II owes a lot to the games that had come before it. Formative works like Ultima 4 and The Bard's Tale had both redefined what story could be in an RPG back in the early 80s. More contemporaneous and likely more relevant to Final Fantasy II, you also had the likes of Dragon Quest IV and Phantasy Star 2. The former placed a heavy emphasis on the main character's allies, turning them into fully realized characters in their own right, rather than treating them as mere stats and skills to fill out the combat roster. Dragon Quest IV is the first RPG I know of where you were more likely to fill out your party based on which characters you liked as characters than you were to select them strictly for their tactical advantages. As for Phantasy Star 2, it brought the manga-inspired cutscene sequences of games like Ninja Gaiden and the incipient CD-ROM anime boom into the RPG, giving greater cinematic heft to its key moments. While PS2 didn't tell a whole lot more in the way of story than its predecessor had, it did so with far more finesse. Thanks to its presentation, key moments like Nei's death hit harder than they would have otherwise. So Final Fantasy II takes all of these influences and raises them to the next level. As much as the active time battle system keeps the moment-to-moment play lively, the game's brisk approach to narrative has a similar effect on the overall flow of the adventure. The plot keeps you hurtling from one event to the next at such a breakneck pace that you never really have time to stop and wonder if the story even makes sense. I mentioned that FF2 doesn't seem to have much regard for player agency, and that fact really becomes clear in a handful of sequences that represent effective points of no return, where events fling you forward into completely new scenarios with no chance to turn back. Not only does FF2 have a tendency to lock you into strange dungeons full of powerful monsters, it also rearranges your party at will. While the concept of gaining and occasionally losing party members had been baked into the console genre by this point, it had never been quite so volatile a process as you see here. But that's a big part of what makes Final Fantasy II so exciting. You never really know what's going to happen next. Maybe you'll be shipwrecked and lose all your companions. Maybe a trusted friend will turn against you. Maybe a valued comrade will sacrifice their life to save everyone else to prevent some great disaster. Will your airship be destroyed? Will your team be stranded next to a river of magma deep underground? You simply never know until the next plot point plays out. Final Fantasy II's only constant is its protagonist, Cecil Harvey. But even he ends the adventure a very different man than the one he starts out as. But that too is a big part of what makes FF2's flimsy melodrama work. The game's overarching story is as wildly incoherent as it is wide-reaching. It spans the entirety of the world plus the hidden dwarf kingdom below plus the lost civilization on the moon. The true villain's motives never go beyond he is a very bad person who hates everything, and the events he sets into motion aren't much more developed than that either. Characters die to make grand gestures that don't really matter in the long run, but that's okay because those characters end up not actually dying anyway, mostly. The entire story feels like a few years' worth of serialized manga condensed down to a 15-hour adventure. In fact, the ending even involves the good guys winning by focusing the earnest prayers of their allies against the villain, Dragon Ball style. Each dungeon and boss is like a standalone volume of that theoretical manga, complete with all the twists and turns and character development you'd expect. While it's not hard to see the presumed influence of manga on FF2's approach to storytelling, the game also owes just as much to live theater. As it turns out, scenario creator Takashi Tokita has a background in theater. And just as Hiroyuki Ito brought his love of racing to FF2's combat system, Tokita used his love of the stage to inform his work on the game. He treats each character as an actor, focusing on staging and what little visible emotion the game's tiny sprites could demonstrate. You can most easily see FF2's theatrical influences in scenes where it plays with space. There's a great example of this during the conversation leading up to the battle with the Colin Braina doll group in the Dwarven Fortress. As the heroes and their allies discuss critical secrets, an enemy spy appears behind the stage presented by the throne room, eavesdropping on the conversation. Given the design of the room in which this takes place, that should be physically impossible. But the conspicuous appearance of the spy isn't meant to indicate its actual actions, but rather serve as a visual tip to the player that something is amiss. Tokita also uses the combat system as a stage. In fact, many of the most significant story events in Final Fantasy II play out as battles, some of which the player has no control over. Like most other console RPGs of the era, Final Fantasy II divides its combat and exploration into two separate viewpoints, with the overhead view of towns and dungeons giving way to a static battle diorama when enemies attack. As it happens, the iconic Final Fantasy combat viewpoint, which typically places monsters on the left and heroes on the right, lends itself perfectly to theatrical staging. Indeed, later Final Fantasy sequels would play up this concept with scenes like Final Fantasy VI's Opera and Final Fantasy IX's production of Let Me Be Your Canary. But here the play is the game itself, with pop-up dialogue windows during combat serving double duty for both battle information and character dialogue. FF2 blurs the line between battle and story, sometimes even pitting two party members against one another. This happens for the first time when your comrade Tella the Sage suddenly lashes out at a bard in the ruins of Damsian Castle. People remember this encounter for the fact that Tella famously calls Edward a spoony bard here, but a big part of what really makes it memorable is the fact that it's the first battle sequence that plays out beyond the player's control. Tella, a party member, initiates the battle and fights Edward solo, completely under the computer's control and without the involvement of either Cecil or the player. This is a betrayal of the way combat had always worked in every Final Fantasy to this point, and the fact that you're powerless to stop your own team member from pounding on this poor dumb bard makes it jarring. These automated sequences pop up a few times throughout the story, including Tella's pointless self-sacrifice to destroy the evil Golbez, and Cecil's literal battle to vanquish his darker nature. The bad guys get their chances to shine in combat too. Golbez uses battle dialogue to taunt players, and to express disbelief when Tella's final act vaporizes him with a hail of meteorites. Milon launches a sneaky back attack to reveal his true form on Mount Ordeals. The noble Rubicant opens his encounter by healing players to ensure a fair fight. Tokita has fun with combat staging too, as with the incompetent Dr. Lugai and his Frankenstein's monster. The Doctor tries to direct his creation to attack the player's party, and it backfires in his face. This of course makes Lugai's second engagement all the more daunting, since he hits hard and can use all kinds of nasty side effects that can debilitate the party, which is quite the contrast to his incompetent initial appearance. Even lesser foes can get in on the battle dialogue action. Certain enemies work as leaders who can trigger their subordinates' power by calling out combat commands. This happens most infamously when you encounter a toad lady and her 6 tiny toads. She begins the battle by shouting, "Croak, my dears," at which point all 6 of her minions cast the toad spell on the party, potentially turning one or all of the heroes into frogs. The overall effect of Final Fantasy II's dynamic approach to storytelling is to blur the line between the game's presentation formats. Now story can play out anywhere, at any time, and the computer can take control in either viewpoint to tell the tale it wants to. Now this is a pretty far cry from the way narrative happened in D&D. In tabletop gaming, all but the most authoritarian game masters draft up plans for a campaign, but allow the moment-to-moment story to evolve in response to the action of the players. You don't have that option here. Cecil's journey to defeat the evil Zemus on the moon happens in rigid lockstep, and the player's only freedom comes in when you initiate each next step and how many side quests you bother to pursue first. Still, FF2 does a remarkable job of attempting to distill the tabletop experience into a linear narrative form by way of Cecil's allies. Wizardry had introduced the idea of a multi-member combat team 10 years before this to serve as an equivalent of a team of people sitting around a table. Games like Dragon Quest IV help turn those other characters into something more than just roster slots by giving them personality. Final Fantasy II takes this concept one step further by allowing Cecil's allies to operate outside the player's control according to their own personal motivations and needs. The Japanese Final Fantasy II for Famicom had toyed around with this idea by leaving the fourth party slot effectively open for most of the game, allowing different temporary characters to drop into and out of the team as the story dictated. Here though, everyone except Cecil is essentially a temporary character. You first see this when Tella goes on the offensive against Edward, but it happens throughout the game. Cecil's partner Kane Highwind betrays the party more than once, abandoning everyone at the worst possible moments. Fledgling wizards Palom and Porum sacrifice themselves to save the team, as do Yang and Sid at various points. Rydia vanishes in the same boat accident that rips Edward from the team. In fact, the only character who doesn't drop out after joining the team is Edge, the weak link of the final party formation. These changes aren't simply the game being mercurial though. Each and every one ties in with the bigger storyline, and more importantly, they fit the characters' individual motivations. Final Fantasy II goes to great pains to help you understand what drives every party member. It's all presented with the extreme economy of a huge script on a tiny ROM cartridge. But even so, you never have any question why any party member has teamed up with Cecil, and why they sometimes decide to go their own way. Tella, for example, wants to protect and later avenge his daughter. When Cecil's mission doesn't line up with that extremely specific objective, Tella's all too happy to strike out on his own. Kane, on the other hand, is torn between his devotion to justice and his envy over the way the woman he loves, Rosa, actually loves Cecil. So when he turns on Cecil, he does so because he's been brainwashed by the evil Zemus and Golbez, but also because his resentment makes him easily controlled. Final Fantasy II throws in lots of little story moments to help better define the cast. Early in the adventure, Cecil, Tella, and Rydia stop in a dungeon save point to set up camp and talk. This works as a tutorial moment since the forced encampment demonstrates the functions of save points. But it also doubles as a quiet moment of contemplation in which Cecil explains his and Rydia's circumstances to Tella and vice versa, offering insight into all three characters. And there I think is Final Fantasy II's most important innovation in game narrative. Prior to this, RPG stories were about the quest, the larger story that players chased from town to town. There's certainly an epic story serving as the backdrop here, but that's not really the point. Final Fantasy II is an internally motivated story, rather than being solely motivated externally. The characters drive the story as much as the need for the player to resolve the big picture. Cecil begins the game by performing two terrible actions in rapid succession in his role as captain of the Kingdom of Baron's air fleet. In the game's cold opening, he plunders an elemental crystal from Mysidia, a village of defenseless mages. Then he unwittingly annihilates the Summoners of Mist by unleashing a disaster in the town. His personal quest then becomes one of redemption, not only to make amends for being party to war crimes, but to put a stop to the forces that abused his power in the first place. Tella, on the other hand, just wants to avenge his daughter, while Edward seeks to absolve himself of his guilt for allowing her death. Edge also seeks revenge. Hallam and Porum spy on Cecil to make sure he doesn't pull a fast one on Mysidia again. Rosa simply wants to be with Cecil. Yang and Cid hope to do what's right, and Cecil's uncle, the Lunarian Fusoya, knows the score and wants to stop Zemus, period. These characters come together and fly apart as both circumstances and their personal quests dictate. Besides keeping things lively in terms of narrative, this tendency also keeps you on your toes in combat. Because the skills of FF2's characters are defined in advance, you lack the power here to create an all-around team capable of handling any situation. Instead, you have to tackle each scenario with the hand you're dealt, even if that means you have poor elemental attack options, or a physically fragile group forced to rely on Cecil to soak up damage for them, or a white mage without enough magic points to be able to sling healing spells with impunity. But FF2 is quite conscientious about never placing players into a scenario they can't possibly hope to win. Indeed, the fact that the game's creators had total control over your party makeup gave them the freedom to create combat situations specifically crafted to your abilities. What FF2 sacrifices in terms of freedom and flexibility, it more than makes up for with its rich, for its era, storytelling, and its well-tuned battle mechanics. The thing that makes FF2 such a critical moment in RPG history is the way it so brilliantly blurs the line between combat, quest, and character storytelling. Next time, we'll close this miniseries on Final Fantasy II with a look at how all of its elements come together, and how the underlying game was strong enough to survive a sketchy localization for the years.